What I would like to show you is how to go about creating some basic statistics for your data in Excel. So when we collect our data, we generally have a whole bunch of different data points, but to be able to look at overall patterns and trends, we generally want to just look at the average and the error associated with those different treatments. So let's say, for example, I want to know how does fertilizer affect plant height. So here I have three different treatments. I have my control, in which they got no fertilizer. I have fertilizer A and fertilizer B. And so these are the heights of the plants in each of those categories. I could plot all of the data, but again, it doesn't allow me to see the pattern very well. So if I plot the averages instead, that would be a much easier way to see if there is a difference between my different conditions. So to do this in Excel, we can just use some of the formulas that Excel already has. So the first thing we're going to do is calculate the average. So for the average, what we're going to do is use a formula, and there's two different ways that you can do this. You can go up here to the formula and search for it, and you can see here it is right here, average, or if you know it, you can just type it in. So for average, it is average. Right? So what you're going to do is highlight all of your data and then hit enter. And it gives me my average right there. Now I can do this for all of my different columns, or I can just highlight that cell, hover my cursor over until I get the black plus sign, and drag it over. And it will do the average for each of the subsequent columns. So you can see here, it's the average for column B, here is the average for column C, and so on and so forth. Okay. So now I have my average, and I can see that my average for the control is about half of what it is for my fertilizer. So it suggests that fertilizer does have an effect on plant height, but it doesn't say anything about the variability within those treatments. And so the next thing that I'm going to do is my standard deviation. And the standard deviation basically tells me how much variability there is within each of those treatments around that mean value that I just calculated. Okay. And so again, I can just type it in. I can look it up in my formulas. So for this one, it's equal STDEV. And again, I'm going to highlight all of my data, but just the data. Make sure not to highlight your average. And there is my standard deviation. So again, I can just copy that over. So now I have my average for each treatment, and I have the amount of variability around each of those treatments. But when we do standard deviation, it doesn't take into account the sample size. The larger your sample size, the more accurate a representation of your mean you have. So for this one, I'm also going to calculate my standard error. And standard error is basically your sample deviation divided by your sample size. Okay, so for here, you can see I have 6 different treatment replicates. Okay? So to calculate my standard error, it's basically the standard deviation that I just calculated divided by the square root of my sample size. So I'm going to create another formula. I always have to start it with an equal sign, so there's my equal. I'm going to select the cell that has my standard deviation that I just calculated, use the backslash for division, divided by the square root, which is SQRT, parentheses, and 6, because that is my sample size. And because I have the same sample size for all of my treatments, I again can just copy and paste it over. Okay. So now I can compare between my different treatments to see if there actually is a difference. Right? So I want to make sure that there is no overlap between them. So because my error is fairly small, right? So my average for control is about 2.6 plus or minus 0.2. So that could take it up to 2.8. That's still going to be lower than the lowest point on fertilizer A, which would be 4.95 plus or minus 0.6.